Slavery, which is considered one of the country's biggest tragedies, was responsible for an unimaginable amount of human pain and death. People frequently refer to the Stanford jail experiment as an example of the violence that can be displayed by humans when they are in positions of power. On the other hand, we don't have to look any further than our own past to find examples like these. Slaves might be punished for a wide variety of offenses, including stealing, being lazy, escaping from their masters, and even speaking their native language. According to some reports, those who were held in slavery were even punished for the sake of sport. In this video, we will cover 10 most heinous forms of discipline ever administered to slaves in the United States. Whipping. In the United States of America, slaves, including children and pregnant women, were frequently flogged as a form of corporal punishment. The infamous photograph of the slave Gordon, also known as Whipped Peter, shows that the flesh on his back was raised and scarred in a lattice pattern as a result of violent and frequent beatings from a whip. Having said that, there were certain owners who did not stop there. When the wounds of their slaves started to heal, these owners gave orders for the wounds to be sliced open and for materials like red pepper and turpentine to be administered to the open wounds. The master of the slaves is said to have pulverized a brick into rubble and dust, combined it with grease, and then had it massaged into the wounds of the slaves. Mutilation. Slaves were frequently made to work under situations that were physically challenging to the extreme, particularly in agricultural settings such as fields and cotton plantations. Other slaves were required to perform labor in the homes of their masters and were held to the standards of being well-groomed and clean. The skin of these slaves was typically lighter, and they had better speaking skills. Protecting and preserving the bodies of slaves seems like a reasonable precaution to take in either scenario. However, this only occurred very infrequently. It was regular practice for slave owners to issue orders for the mutilation of their slaves' bodies, particularly in situations when slaves had fought with each other or opposed their masters or overseers. There were times when it was necessary to sever an ear or make cuts into the skin. Amputating limbs, gouging out eyes, severing hamstrings, or even castrating both males and females were some of the most extreme cases. In several of the incidents, the victims did not receive any kind of medical care. Some of them succumbed to consequences such as infection, loss of blood, and others. Brandings. The process of branding the flesh involves using a heated metal instrument to char it. In most cases, the purpose of this form of torture was to establish ownership. Large enterprises frequently branded their slaves in order to make them easily identifiable and to stop the theft and resale of slaves. This practice was implemented for both of these reasons. In the end, these brands were utilized as physical evidence in order to disprove the assertions made by larger businesses that the activity had never taken place. A law known as the Code Noir in Louisiana authorized the practice of branding slaves as a form of retribution for escaping their masters. By the year 1840, New Orleans had become home to the greatest slave market in all of America, and as a result, an uncountable number of people were forced to comply with this decree. When someone ran away from their master, a typical form of punishment in the South was to be branded. A letter or any other kind of identifying mark was frequently burned into the face of the slave. Because of this, the individual was typically disqualified from working in any capacity related to houses or serving. Smoked alive. At some point in time, a number of slave states enacted laws that addressed the maintenance of slaves, as well as their rights and welfare. Slaves should have been afforded some degree of protection from brutal treatment as a result of this, at least in theory. In point of fact, these laws were very sporadically enforced. According to some reports, the practice of abusing one's children and subjecting them to various forms of punishment grew in popularity in a variety of states. Emancipated slave William W. Brown provided some insight into a typical procedure that is followed in Virginia. He told about a master who kept his slaves chained up and beat them while they were inside the smokehouse. Then, as a further form of punishment, he built a fire with tobacco stems and caused the slaves to choke and smoke in it. The hog's head. Former slaves have the potential to provide the most terrible stories of the abuse and torture suffered by slaves. Moses Roper's mother was of African and Native American descent, and she was a slave for his English father. Moses was born to her. After Moses was finally freed from his servitude, he recorded his experiences in a book. He provided a detailed account of the numerous humiliations and tortures that slaves in America were forced to endure. Moses related how some masters used physical punishment not only as a sport, but also for the pleasure it brought them. He told of a slave owner who would drive nails into a hog's head, a huge barrel, and then leave the nail points sticking out of the inside of the barrel. The owner of the slaves and the other slaves watched as their master put his prisoners into these barrels and rolled them down long, steep slopes. Suspended beneath a cooking fire. Harriet Jacobs was another person who managed to flee slavery and later wrote about her experiences. She detailed how she came to be in the possession of a slave owner who, despite the complaints of the slave owner's wife, engaged in sexually harassing behavior toward her on a regular basis. Before making her escape to England, Harriet evaded him by first hiding for 7 years in a crawl space in the roof of her grandmother's house. Harriet related an additional terrifying story about a slaveholder who lived in the neighborhood where she grew up. He owned a large number of slaves. His preferred method of retribution was to bind a slave, hoist him into the air, and light a fire above him while he was still alive. A pork chop with a lot of fat on it was roasted over the fire. The burning fat eventually spilled into the slave's exposed flesh, leaving it a horrible burn. Demotion or sale. A slave's life or death may depend on whether or not they are subjected to this form of punishment, which, in comparison to the other horrifying treatments described in this article, may appear to be less severe. The public record shows that George Washington supported the use of caning and other forms of corporal punishment for slaves. However, he was also in favor of demoting slaves who did not work hard enough and selling runaways who had been caught a second time. Many slaves who worked in settings that were less taxing on their bodies, such as in the house or in a skilled craft, were relegated to work in the fields. These conditions included working in hot, humid conditions. This led to harsher physical conditions, more physically demanding work, and often more violent treatment from owners and overseers than was previously the case. In the worst possible scenarios, slaves were sold for low rates to owners who had a reputation for mistreating their slaves or even working them to death in abusive conditions. Public burnings. The public was frequently made aware of the punishments. The other slaves were made to see this as a warning that if they did not behave, they would receive the same form of punishment. As a sort of entertainment, occasionally other owners as well as people from neighboring towns came to observe. In spite of the abolition of slavery, public executions via lynching and hanging persisted well into the 20th century. Burning in public was a horrifying procedure that was used as a form of punishment. Slaves were either chained to a stake or held above a fire while they were kept as property. Before the flames started to consume their flesh, there were some slaves who passed out or fainted from inhaling too much smoke. However, before they eventually passed away, many people were tormented by the flames. Long-term chaining. Throughout the course of slavery's history, there is abundant evidence to support the use of chains. It began aboard slave ships, where Africans who had been taken were chained together and held captive within the hulls of the ships. Slaves who ran away from their masters more than once were frequently subjected to long terms of chaining. They were shackled either to the workstations they were assigned to or to other slaves. In certain circumstances, large numbers of slaves were chained together in lengthy lines in order to carry out menial duties in unison. This was the beginning of the notorious chain gang system that was implemented in American jails. Even by the standards of the 19th century, Madame Delphine Lalaurie is remembered as a woman who earned a bad reputation for the way she treated her slaves. Before a fire broke out in her home in 1834, a number of inquiries were carried out to ascertain the condition of her slaves. It is believed that an elderly female slave who worked in the kitchen ignited the fire in an attempt to take her own life. She was restrained to the stove when it was on and the fire was burning. After that, a number of slaves were found living in deplorable conditions in the attic of the Lalaurie house. They were held up by their necks, and their limbs were shackled in a way that strained and tore them. They were suspended in this position. Forced reproduction. slaves were subjected to severe forms of sexual harassment and assault, including rape, on a regular basis. There were no laws in place to prevent this from happening. Women who became pregnant as a result of this abuse received very little in the way of medical attention or specialized treatment the majority of the time. On the contrary, they were frequently treated with greater severity by the spouses of their lords. Slave masters not only used their male slaves as sexual prostitutes, but also abused them and had them sleep with a variety of other women. In the years after the passage of the Act prohibiting the importation of slaves by the United States Congress in 1808 and its subsequent implementation, the South experienced a severe lack of available slave labor. The domestic market for slaves flourished, which led to an increase in the demand for black individuals. As a direct consequence of this, slaves were frequently acquired and disposed of according to their childbearing capacities. They were compelled to have sexual relations with other slaves in order to increase their offspring population. In most cases, slaves had the ability to select the male partner with whom they would have children. However, there are records of matches that were conducted based on physical traits. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.